Welcome to this week of Fabric Fodder, and we are going to be doing stenciling. I'm going to just go over the basics of stenciling. There's so much more available out there by people who are far more expert than I am in terms of stenciling techniques, but I will be showing you kind of the basics of how I use stencils, both commercial stencils and also how you can create your own stencils, whether they're ones that you use once or twice, or they're ones that you cut out of a material that lasts significantly longer than that. But I will kind of go over the basics of the materials you need and the techniques that I use. Again, just the basics here, but I do use stenciling a lot in projects that I create. It's a great way to add unique elements to a project. So anyway, enjoy and hope you have fun with it. Welcome to this week's Fabric Fodder, and today we're going to talk about stenciling. I'm just going to go over the basics of stenciling on fabric. There are people who are far more expert in doing this than I am, but I do definitely want to kind of touch on it because it's kind of one of the basics that I've used in the past, along with the painting and the stamping. And then once we're kind of over these couple of basics, then we can move on to starting to combine different techniques and doing some other things which are much more exciting and unique and interesting. But stenciling has been a favorite of mine for many years. For instance, like this one's from 2000. This is a bag and it's been squished into a box for many years. But this purse has some stenciling on it with some leaves and some other geometrics with some stitching on it. It's done on both sides. Here's another one that's very recent, and this has some stenciling on it, some letters and numbers on it, that sort of thing, as well as some painted background, and then stitching and applique stuff on the top, some numbers and stuff over here as well. Then on this one, this has some stenciling here, and I don't know if it shows up on camera, but this kind of shadowy looking stuff, this is something I'm also going to be showing you hopefully in the next couple of days, that you can use stencil stamps, that sort of thing, to kind of uncolor things. But this is, again, some stenciling on this bag. And then this last one is a quilt, and this is from sometime in the 90s. I don't recall exactly when, but with this one, I made whole blocks. And what I did with this is I had the fabric the size of the block, and then I created a stencil out of freezer paper that was also the size of the block. And if you remember from elementary school, folding paper up and making snowflakes, potentially you might remember that. But these squares of freezer paper that I would fold in quarters on the diagonal and quarters on the axes to where it was triangular shape. And then I would cut out what you see in that triangle, and it would create blocks. So each of these blocks was a different stencil. And this was done with the Lumiere, the Jacquard Lumiere metallic paint. So that one's got little elephants, butterflies, flowers. So there's 9 different blocks. I won't show you all of them, but this has dragonflies, some tulips, and then some bees. So you can see how you can use stenciling not just in a collage type manner to be background or foreground, but you can actually do things like on a quilt create blocks. So let me talk a little bit about some stencils. Now you can use any number of commercially available stencils, and they come in all sorts of sizes and what's available, what's inside on them. Now, I am not one who cleans my stencils if I'm just using acrylic paint on them. I just let them dry. Otherwise, I'd spend more time cleaning stencils and using them. The only time I do clean them is when I'm using something that's unique or unusual, whether it's some thicker mediums and stuff like that. But just acrylic paint, I will just use the paint and not wash it off. But they come in different sizes, different materials that they're made out of. There's some larger ones. Here's that feather that I used on that one purse. Grids, one of my favorites. And those are stencils. Similar to a stencil is a mask. With a stencil, the part that's being blocked is the part that you want to leave whatever your substrate is that you're stenciling onto, and your paint goes in those open spots. With a mask, and these are some old Tim Holtz ones from 2008. He doesn't do masks anymore, but it's a good example to show. With a mask, and these have a sticky back onto them, but with a mask, my dog is barking, I apologize. With a mask, I don't know how I can show this best. Maybe on a piece of fabric so you'll see the shine. So the mask goes down, and it's the object that's going to stay the color of your background substrate, and you will paint and typically feather it out around it. So a mask is kind of like an area that you block out, versus a stencil. A good example on these is like these leaves right here. Your stencil you're doing, you want what you the negative space is the part that you want to be painting, whereas with a mask, the negative space is the part that's staying the substrate, if that makes sense. And masks can be made out of the exact same materials as you make stencils out of. So masks and stencils are related. I'll get these out of the way. And again, you can use any number of the commercially available stencils from any number of companies that are out there, and they come in pretty much a wide variety of images and such that you may be interested in. Some are super detailed, some are not. So I would say the sky's the limit in terms of that. Now, I do want to mention two stenciling people that, especially for on fabric, that again, as I said, I don't profess to be an expert. I'm just touching on some of the basics when it comes to stencils. But for commercial stencils, the two that I would recommend looking at are Stencil Girl. And they have huge variety of more artistic style of stencils. They're not as kind of crafty as like you might find in some of the big box stores. And then Mary Beth, who owns Stencil Girl, on her YouTube, she's got incredible number of videos showing you doing things on paper, doing it on fabric. And if you can do it on paper, generally, you can do it on fabric as well. And so I highly recommend viewing some of her videos and such if you're interested in further knowledge. She's been doing this for 25 plus years, I think. She's had her company, so I highly recommend that. Another person who is kind of my idol when it comes to stenciling on fabric is Diane Erickson. I remember following the work of her mother, Lois Erickson, as well, and they have done mainly garment sewing, and Diane does some incredibly creative clothing, and stenciling is one of the things that she does on them. She has a website, dianeerickson.com. So another place that I highly recommend some of her she has stencils available too, and some of them are probably some of the most beautiful to my eye stencils out there. So anyway, that's for commercial stencils. And again, there's a zillion and two other companies that make stencils. One of the things I also like to do is to create my own stencils. And there's any number of materials. that you can use. As I mentioned with that one quilt, I use freezer paper, and you can get freezer paper from C&T in these 8.5 by 11 sheets, to where if you want to draw something, you can then run it through your printer and print it onto here and cut it out, or you can draw it right onto the freezer paper. You can also get the freezer paper in the roll at the grocery store. Excuse me. It has a papery side and it has the shiny wax side that can be ironed onto your fabric, and it will stick and easily peel off and not leave any residue. So for stencils that you want to use a couple of times, freezer paper is awesome because it's easy to work with, easy to cut, that sort of thing. You can also use acetate. Here I wanted this kind of edge, so I just cut these little nubbins out of a piece of just acetate that you can get at the office supply stores or online. Many times it's used for transparency type of things, but just you can also use packaging, plastic, that sort of thing. But it's also, again, an easy way. This is going to be a little bit more durable, will last longer than a freezer paper one will. You can cut out of just file folders. Easy, again, to cut out of. Probably one or two time use using file folders, because the manila folder material, once it gets wet, tends to warp when it dries. So not something that you're going to use over and over and over again, but it's great for single use temporary type ones. You can also purchase stencil film that has a matte finish on it. This is from Graphics. There's any number of materials that you can get to create stencils out of. This one I like just because it's a little bit thinner, so it's easier to cut. I have some heavier stuff, a little harder to cut when you're using a craft knife. You can also get a tool that kind of looks like a soldering iron that you can use to cut with. I have one. I don't know where it is because I don't use it, because it doesn't give quite as clean a cut as I'd really like. One of the greatest ways to cut really nice, clean stencils, sometimes when they're highly detailed and delicate, is using your cutting machine, whether it's like a Cricut or a Silhouette or one of those. I keep planning to pull my Silhouette out and create some stencils with it, but I don't know how to use it, the machine itself. So there's the learning curve of the machine, as well as the learning curve of figuring out how to do the stencils. One other thing that you can do, especially with film like this, is you can also use your die cuts that you may have, whether it's the positive or the negative image, so to create either stencils or masks. And so cutting it out of this material works really well. Another film-like material that you can use is Duralar. Again, it's a graphics company. Get it mainly at art supply stores or online. And it's clear. The beauty of it is if you get the right one, you have to get the one, this isn't the right one, this is for wet media, but there's another one too that is somewhat heat resistant. So if it gets hot at all, it's not going to warp and such. But there's any number of different films, plastics, and papers that you can use to create your own stencils. So I wanted to show you real quick just some out of freezer paper stencils where I've just drawn it on the paper side. I can then iron this down onto my fabric and stencil it, move it, iron it down again and stencil it. But what I've done here is I've drawn it, I've cut most of it out, and then I left a couple of pieces where I can then cut it out. Now you want to use it on a cutting surface. And I'm not, because it's not critical, the cutting is, absolutely perfect on the line. I can be a little bit quick and not as necessarily perfect because this is kind of a quick and primitive looking piece anyway. It's kind of like a band or a border. And it's just quick and easy to cut out because it's just paper. You can do the same thing with any of those films. They just require a little bit more pressure with your craft knife in order to cut it out. But that's how easy that is to create a stencil. Maybe if you wanted to do some sort of border or something like that. Another one that's really cool to make stencils and or masks out of is just some clear contact paper. It's, when you get it on the roll, it has the side that is supposed to be up, and then it's got a paper backing on it so that you can cut it out and it has a sticky backing on it. And that makes, especially for doing mask type things, these are great with that sticky on there. I find if you have larger or more complicated type of stencils, anything with a sticky back is a little harder to get it laying flat. So anything that's a little bit larger, that's when I recommend it's either out of something like a freezer paper to where it's not trying to stick while you're trying to place it, or out of a film or something like that. Anything that has a stickiness on it is going to be, anytime it gets a little bit larger, it's just a little bit harder to get it everything laying flat because it's trying to stick while you're trying to lay it down. So anyway, here's just, like I said, a couple of paper stencils. So let me get some fabric out and some colors out, and we're going to use a couple of these paper stencils and also use some of the commercial stencils. All right, so I've got this one all to where I've ironed it down so the freezer paper is now adhered to my piece of fabric, and I'm ready to do some painting on it. A couple of colors, and I'm going to use a paper plate to put my paint palette on. Now, when you're applying paint, there's any number of things that you can use. A couple of other kinds of brushes. So you can use a sponge brush like you get at the hardware store. There's also sponge dabbers that are intended specifically for stenciling. I've also used my Tim Holtz inker thingy with the foam, those domed foam things, and that works great. Cosmetic sponges, I like the little wedges. They work great because what I do is I use the bigger end and then I just chop that one off. So I can usually use 2 or 3 colors out of one of these. They also come in rounds. I usually cut those in half. You can get stencil brushes which are flat, and they come in any number of sizes. Not as much my favorite. I also use these kind of brushes, the natural hair brushes, or just any kind of regular brush. It will actually work. But again, the wedges are my favorites. So that's what we're going to go ahead and use right now. So I'm just going to use my regular acrylic. Of course, you know, my dog's got to bark. My cat's got to be in here. It's like I turn the video on and everybody says, let's make noise. Now, when you are stenciling on fabric, in general, you want it to be a little bit more kind of has dry brush, but we're using sponges. But you don't want a lot of paint build up, especially if you're using a stencil to that it's not adhered, and so the paint can ooze underneath. So you want your paint, you want to kind of spread it out and really dab it, and you don't want a ton of paint on your applicator. And sometimes that necessitates that you end up maybe doing more than one layer in order to get the paint on there. It will also bring out kind of cool texture of the fabric. Now, I tend to be a dabber when I'm stenciling. There are some people that brush, but the problem with the brushing is it does tend to try to kind of force your paint a bit underneath your stencil a bit. I want some of this turquoise to be in there as well. Kind of blend them in a little bit together. Come back to the green. Trying to get better in my camera placement, because what I see when I finish filming and what actually ends up after I edit, it has a tendency to shrink my field a bit. So I'm trying to make sure I'm in the middle and not close to the edge. Now here, my stencil's coming up just a bit, but that's fine. Okay, so once I have that down, then I can just peel this up. You can see how cool that looks. So if I were doing a long strip, I could do a long strip. Otherwise, I can just place it. Where's my thread from my fabric? So I can place it. See if I want this next to it. Maybe I want to turn it around and go here. Then I can just iron this back down again. So let me do that real quick. All right, we're ready to paint that second band. This green. Again, you're just trying to get a nice even coating on your sponge or applicator. To dab it on. Blend again some more of this turquoise in there. And then we're ready to peel that off again. So there you've got some pieces that would be on a small project. We could use those each individually. They could be used together. All sorts of potential for something like that. And I'm real pleased with those colors. All right, so another one. This is one of my favorites. I've used this one, in fact, these similar colors on it, with these spiral things on it. So I could do the entire stencil, or I can just do portions of it. So if I wanted to have a piece that kind of popped out, we can do something like that. So I'm going to bring in a different green. Kind of stay in a similar palette since I have these out. So as you can see here, just same colors, similar palette, but I just brought in this more kind of Kelly green. And again, if you think there's potential, you're going to be needing to wash your fabric, make sure you put some of your fabric medium in it. So with this one, I'm just gonna do some of this. And this one, you're just kind of holding it down. And I'm gonna kind of blend it out a bit. Use a little bit of this lighter green now. And this is really, as I said, not much different from when I'm doing this onto paper. the biggest key on fabric is just not using too much paint on your applicator. Brighter green here in the middle. I'm just blending it out. So this can then potentially even work with this in a project, with this being the center. Now you see when I went back and added some paint to that middle and my sponge was a little bit more saturated, it kind of bled a little bit, which I don't have any problems with that. I think it looks just fine anyway, but doing it on this batiksed fabric has kind of a mottled background, and then you put that cool color on it. You can do, this would be a fun one with these swirls, is to do some hand stitching on this, that sort of thing. So that's another one. Let's go with this one. This is one of my hand dyed. Now see, I can take this and with my scissors, if I don't want to do the green, I just pop the top off of it and then I'm ready to go with a different color. So if I want to get away from those green tones, all right, let's go with a little bit different color palette. I have a magenta, maybe a little bit of a teal or a deeper turquoise, and a little bit of orange. Try all those. These ones that Tim Holtz has, to where they're divided, is half as one pattern, half as another. Those are a great way to have a more extensive stencil collection by having those doubles in there. So I love the dots and the X's. This is a Stencil Girl stencil that's Seth Apter's, and I love this one as well. I love all the shapes and such. So you can do a sort of collage type thing with the stenciling on your fabric. Every bit as much, that's not the right term. You can do it, as I have been saying, the same way as you do on paper. So we can stencil collage some bits on here to where we can kind of create our own pattern in the colors that we may want to use. I love these diamond things. Again, the biggest key is not to get too much paint. Even when you're doing it on paper, the same sort of thing applies, is don't use a lot of paint. It's better to go a couple of layers than too much paint, so it doesn't ooze out and around. But again, this is kind of why I prefer the sponge, the cosmetic sponge applicator, over a something else like a brush. It just, I seem to feel a better sense of control over what I'm applying. So hopefully I'm still on screen. There we go. Let me move that up a little bit. So we've got a couple layers of some of those colors on there. And now I'm going to do the blue. I still have the red or the orange and pink on there, but that's okay. So then maybe we'll pull in, let's go some of these little dot guys here. overlap some of that. And with something like this, you could do much larger pieces that are almost like doing some yardage. If you were wanting to do a bigger project, by all means, you could do that, especially with these kinds of stencils. Let's see, let's flip this around. Always a good idea to get a different point of view every once in a while to see if you like how your colors are flowing, that sort of thing. And one last little tiny bit over here. And just like on paper, you know, kind of feathering it out a little bit, but that gives you, showing that in some a little bit brighter colors rather than the dull colors, but that creates your own pattern in your own colors, depending on what it is that you're wanting to do. You can do a small piece like this, or you can do larger yardage, and it allows the background color to come through while adding some color on top, which is a lot of fun. So next, let's do something that this could potentially be in a small quilt. Maybe this is like a block. So I can do something like this feather. So I'm going to use another plate. I'm going to go a little bit different colors. All right, so I'm going to go with kind of a buff, kind of neutral. It's kind of a greenish gray. It will squish out. Oh, that's like a rock. I haven't used this one in a while, can you tell? Yeah, okay, well, we're not using that one. Okay, we're going to kind of use a warmish gray and a kind of greenish dark gray. I was going to use this light blue. Let's see. Use a real kind of sky. Should have shaken that one. These things don't happen unless I have a camera on, and then everything just works absolutely no issue. I swear. All right, I'm gonna get a clean stamp thing here. So I'm gonna take and do this guy. Do some of this dark down here. You know, I'm gonna pull in one of my brushes, and again with these flat brushes, because I want this to be a little bit more stipply looking, I'm gonna do it with the brush rather than the sponge. That way you can kind of see a little bit too how that works. So I'm gonna, again, you want your brush kind of dab a lot of the paint off, and you want it kind of a dryish brush. So I'm gonna do this one all the way kind of up there. And again, I'm tamping rather than actually brushing. A little bit more dark in places here. And then I can bring in some of this light blue kind of to highlight some sections. So then I can lift that, and that gives you this really pretty soft kind of brush, kind of stencil. I'll get it out here eventually. My brain is working on, I'm going to dry that really quick. The heat tool. And the reason for drying it before I do the second one, because if I want to do the second one close by to the first one, well, I don't want my stencil to get paint on the back side that's wet, so if I move it again. Doesn't take much to get that relatively dry. So then I'm going to use again the same one, maybe doing it down this way a little bit further, and again bringing my brush, stamping a good chunk of the paint off of it. Gonna keep the dark down on this edge, a little on this one. And then go to the gray. By not cleaning my brush out each time, it also helps the colors to kind of blend together a little bit. Bring the blue in. But by using this brush, it just gives it a little bit more of a dabbed kind of look. Now I think I want, let's pop this guy on in here. And I'm not going to do this part down here, but I'm also going to do this in the lighter, so it's more, just kind of dab it real gently next to that other section. Maybe pull a little bit of the gray in on this side. Tiny little dab of the darker color just to give it a little bit of that in there. Pull that off. No, I think the 3. I always like odd numbers. So that gives us a really beautiful image that we can stitch on. You could hand stitch, I could do some machine work on, but I think this would be really beautifully incorporated into another project. So in fact, color-wise, it could actually even work with, you know, something like this if I wanted to. Actually, that round thing going right in there next to those could be really kind of cool, even if I stenciled it right onto this piece, but we won't do that for now. But stenciling is something that, whether you're creating your own stencils or you are, let's do this, whether you're creating your own stencils or you're using commercial ones, either way, stenciling is just a really incredibly fun way to create images on your fabric. It's also just really a fun kind of thing to combine. So I'm taking kind of this caramel color, and even this stuff on my brush, I'm just kind of mixing it in. And so when you have that kind of color mixing in with a color that's really different, it kind of helps it kind of talk to it a bit. So this is a freezer paper one, so I'm not putting it down. I'm just using it, maybe a little bit more of the little bit orangier color up here. And just that little square end. Oh, I like that. That makes me happy. Kind of gives it almost an Asian flavor. So that is something that would be perfect in incorporating that into a project. So, and I always hit the phone so it gets cockeyed, so I apologize for that. So, so if you're creating your own stencils or you are using commercial ones, either way works. If you can't find a commercial one that has the look that you want, you can go ahead and make your own, whether you're using an image that you find and turning that into a stencil or drawing it completely from scratch. Either way, it's going to work. But stenciling, especially when we can combine it with some other techniques and such, is one of my absolute favorites. And I hope you get to experiment yourself with a little bit of stenciling on fabric. Also, don't forget, check out Stencil Girl as well as Diane Erickson. Those are my two go-to places when it comes to stenciling. Diane, more stenciling for fabric, and Mary Beth at Stencil Girl for just stenciling, just because I don't profess to be an expert at stenciling, but they are. So anyway, thanks a bunch.